The story of Chris Watts is one of betrayal, deceit, and cold-blooded murder that shocked America in 2018. How could a loving father and husband turn into a monster overnight? Today, we dive deep into the story of Chris Watts, how he betrayed his family for a mistress, and the shocking revelations that followed. In the small, peaceful town of Frederick, Colorado, where the days begin with the gentle hum of sprinklers and the faint scent of fresh-cut grass, there stood a house on Saratoga Trail. This house, like so many others, was filled with all the outward signs of a happy, thriving family. The Watts family, Chris, his wife, and their two daughters called this place their home. To their friends, their neighbors, and all those who followed their lives online, they were the embodiment of the American dream. Chris Watts, the soft-spoken, dedicated father and husband, was known to be reliable and mild-mannered. He was the kind of person everyone described as a hard worker, someone who went to great lengths to provide for his family. The image he projected was one of calm stability, the kind of man who did everything by the book, steady job, a loving family, a house in a safe neighborhood. Their life was an open book, or so it seemed. The Watts family's journey, their triumphs, their cherished moments, each one meticulously documented and shared with the world. Friends and acquaintances would often see the flood of updates online, the laughter of children, the joy of simple family dinners, the celebrations of birthdays and anniversaries. For anyone who looked, it was clear the Watts family had everything they could ever need. But the question remains, how well can we ever truly know someone? How much of what we see is merely what we are allowed to see? The Watts family lived their lives under the warm glow of the spotlight, where everything seemed perfectly aligned. Yet behind the gleaming smiles, beneath the cheerful updates and polished photographs, there was something hidden, something that no one saw coming. For those who watched from afar, it seemed impossible to imagine that anything could be wrong. Friends would often speak of how close-knit the family seemed. The love between the parents, the joy in their children's eyes, it all felt genuine. But life, as it turns out, is rarely as simple as it seems. The walls of a house can hold secrets, and sometimes the most pristine exteriors hide the darkest truths. It's easy to believe in the perfection of others when all we see is what's on the surface. We are drawn to the highlight reels, the moments that shine. But behind the closed doors of the Watts home, where no social media post could reach, there were whispers that grew louder with each passing day. A darkness that no one could have predicted was slowly creeping in. Chris Watts, the devoted father, the supportive husband, was a man everyone thought they knew. But even those closest to him had no idea what lay beneath the calm surface. As the days turned into nights, and the nights stretched into the early hours, something was brewing in the shadows. Something that no cheerful family photo could capture, no video could reveal. In the quiet of the night, when everyone was asleep, the house would become something else entirely. The echoes of laughter that once filled the rooms were replaced with silence. The ticking of the clock, the creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, it all seemed to take on a life of its own. The house that once felt so warm, so inviting, began to feel like a place where secrets were buried deep. How do you reconcile the image of a loving father with the darkness that was about to unfold? Was it something that had always been there, hidden behind the mask of a perfect life? Or was it the weight of secrets kept for far too long? Secrets that eventually shattered the thin veneer of normalcy. This is the story of the Watts family, a story that begins with laughter, love, and hope, but descends into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. A story that would leave an entire town reeling, a family shattered, and the world asking how the unthinkable could happen in a place that seems sometimes so perfect. The most terrifying stories are not found in the shadows, but in the places where we least expect them, in the homes that we pass by every day, in the lives we think we understand. But behind the facade of the Watts family's perfect life, there lay a secret that would soon come to light, with consequences no one could have foreseen. While the world saw Chris Watts as a devoted husband and loving father, there was another side to his life, a side that was hidden from everyone who thought they knew him. It was within these walls, at his workplace, that Chris's life took a turn that would forever change everything. What started as routine days at the office soon became an escape into a new world, a world where Chris felt free from the pressures of his responsibilities at home. Amidst the mundane routines of work, there was a spark, a connection that would draw him into a web of desires he never imagined. It was here that Chris met Nicole Kessinger, a new face at the company who brought with her a sense of excitement and intrigue. For Chris, it was like a door had been opened. A door to a life that was far removed from the everyday routines of fatherhood and marriage. The more time Chris spent with her, the more he felt a pull and allure that was hard to resist. Nicole represented everything that his life had lost: spontaneity, passion, a feeling of being truly seen. At first, it was just stolen moments, brief encounters filled with the thrill of something forbidden. But as the days turned into weeks, what started as a simple distraction became an all-consuming obsession. Chris began to change, slowly but surely. Those who knew him best could sense that something was different, but they couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. The man who once seemed so committed, so focused on his family, was now distant, distracted. There was a new darkness in his eyes, a sense of restlessness that Shannon could not ignore. Shannon could sense that her husband was slipping away, but she couldn't understand why. Chris, who had once been her rock, was now a man she barely recognized. His late nights, the constant presence of his phone, the emotional distance, it all pointed to something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The warmth and affection that once defined their marriage had turned cold. As Chris became more entangled in his double life, his obsession grew. It was no longer just an affair. It was an escape from a life that he felt was slowly suffocating him. Nicole became his secret refuge, a world where he could forget about the responsibilities and expectations that weighed him down. But with each step he took down this path, he moved further away from the life he had once built with Shannon and their children. How does a man who seemingly has everything, love, stability, a beautiful family, find himself slipping into the arms of another? Was it simply the thrill of something new, or was there a deeper darkness that had been festering all along? Friends would later recall seeing changes in Chris, subtle shifts in his demeanor, but they had no idea just how deeply his newfound obsession had taken root. For Chris, there seemed to be no turning back. The life he once cherished now felt like a cage, and the affair became his escape hatch. But every choice comes with a cost, and for Chris, the price he would ultimately pay would be far more than he ever imagined. Was it the affair alone that pushed Chris to betray everything he had once held dear? Or was it merely the final trigger for a darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for years? A darkness that no one, not even Chris himself, fully understood. You think it was the affair that pushed Chris to betray his family? Or was there something deeper, something far more sinister, that had been hiding all along? The early hours of August 13th, 2018. The small town of Frederick slept peacefully as another summer night passed. But for the Watts family, this was no ordinary night. As the clock struck 1:48 a.m., Shannon Watts pulled into her driveway after a long business trip. Exhausted but relieved to be home, she was eager to slip into the comfort of her bed, to hold her daughters in her arms come morning. Unaware of what awaited her, Shannon stepped into a house that had grown cold in her absence. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now seemed to hold its breath. As she quietly made her way inside, she had no idea that her husband, Chris Watts, was already awake, waiting for her in the shadows. What happened next inside those walls would forever remain a chilling mystery, a sequence of events that only Chris truly knows. What we do know is that within moments of Shannon entering the house, everything changed. It wasn't a warm welcome. There were no embraces, no soft greetings in the night. Instead, a brutal confrontation ensued, one that would leave Shannon gasping for breath, as the life she had known was violently ripped away. Chris claimed that it was a sudden rage, an argument that got out of hand. But the truth, hidden behind his cold eyes, suggests something far more calculated. For Shannon, there was no chance to defend herself, no one to call for help. In those last moments, she was alone with the man who was supposed to protect her, now turned into her executioner. But the horror did not end with Shannon. With her lifeless body now lying on the floor, Chris's thoughts turned to the upstairs bedrooms where Bella and Celeste slept, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding just beyond their door. Bella and Celeste innocent, trusting and full of life. For them, their father was a hero, the one they turned to for comfort. But on this night, Chris was no longer the father they knew. For reasons that defy understanding, he chose to snuff out the very lives he had brought into this world. Bella, the oldest, woke to the sounds in the night, her eyes filled with confusion as she saw her father enter the room. Perhaps, for a fleeting moment, she believed he was there to protect her. But as the darkness closed in, her innocence was shattered. Celeste, the younger of the two, never understood what was happening. Her short life, filled with laughter and joy, ended in the most horrific way, at the hands of the one person she trusted most. Two little lives extinguished in the span of moments, their bright futures, their innocent dreams stolen in the dead of night. As the first light of morning crept into the sky, Chris Watts was faced with a new challenge. The lives he had taken were gone, but now he had to cover his tracks. He had to pretend that nothing was wrong, that he was just a concerned husband searching for his missing family. He would put on a mask of worry and confusion, hoping that his neighbors, friends, and even the police would believe the lies he was about to spin. But for those who looked closely, there was something unsettling about Chris's demeanor. His voice never wavered, his hands never trembled. He was playing the role of a worried husband, a desperate father. Yet behind those eyes, there was a darkness that couldn't be hidden. It was as if he had already rehearsed the performance he was now giving to the world. How could a man who just hours before had taken the lives of his entire family appear so calm, so collected? Was this all part of his plan? Or was it simply the chilling detachment of someone who had crossed a line they could never return from? What do you think was going through Chris's mind that night? Could it have been premeditated? Or was it a crime of passion born out of desperation? Was it the burden of his secrets that drove him, or something darker that had always been lurking beneath the surface? As dawn broke on August 13, 2018, the tranquil facade of the Watts family home began to fracture. With Shannon Watts and her two daughters missing, the police were quickly called to the scene. Chris Watts, the husband and father, greeted officers at the door, his demeanor calm, almost too calm for a man whose family had supposedly vanished without a trace. From the moment the officers stepped inside, something felt off. As they conducted a walkthrough of the house, there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The rooms were neat, the beds were made, and everything appeared to be in its place. Yet, a heavy, unsettling silence hung in the air, as if the walls themselves held secrets they dared not reveal. The search turned up nothing, but as the day went on, neighbors began to come forward with their suspicions. They had seen Chris that morning, moving his truck in a way that seemed out of character, especially for that early hour. One neighbor in particular had something that would change the course of the investigation. Surveillance footage that captured the Watts driveway during those critical hours. The footage revealed movements that contradicted Chris's account. It showed his truck backed into the garage in the early hours, long before he claimed to have left for work. This small detail, seemingly insignificant at first, would become a key piece in unraveling the truth. Investigators now had their first real lead, and it was clear that they needed to dig deep.
We usually park out there on the side. I just want to get everything back in. It'd be easier to lug everything out there, all the tools that I had to bring in. What else can I do with this?
My detective just showed up, so he'll probably want to talk to you. He'd probably, like I said, he might have you call at the bank and see if there's any kind of activity.
Because if there was any sort of action out there,
His camera.
I would have got it.
Like
Right.
we had issues the other week when people were stealing stuff out of like.
Chris had maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no idea what happened to his wife and daughters. But the more the investigators looked into his story, the more inconsistencies they found. His calm demeanor, which had initially seemed reassuring, now came off as disturbingly detached. Friends, neighbors, even seasoned detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. In front of the cameras, Chris pleaded for the safe return of his family. But those who watched couldn't help but notice his lack of emotion. There were no tears, no cracks in his voice, just a hollow, rehearsed plea that left many wondering whether it was all just an act. With mounting suspicions, investigators decided to take a different approach. Chris was brought in for further questioning. At the police station, they asked him to take a polygraph test. Chris agreed, confident that he could prove his innocence. But the test would reveal more than he anticipated. The polygraph results were conclusive. Chris was not telling the truth. His calm exterior had finally cracked, and investigators now had what they needed to confront him. The once cooperative husband was now facing a mountain of evidence that contradicted everything he had claimed. The investigation was closing in, and the pressure on Chris was mounting. The surveillance footage, the failed polygraph, the emotionless interview had all pointed to a single, chilling conclusion. The man who had once portrayed himself as a concerned husband and loving father was now the prime suspect in the disappearance of his own family. Chris's carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. Every detail was scrutinized, every lie exposed. For the detectives on the case, the pieces were finally falling into place, and soon, Chris would have nowhere left to hide. If you were one of the investigators, would you have believed Chris's story at first? What red flags would have stood out to you? Could you have seen through his calm demeanor, or would you have been fooled by his seemingly composed exterior? After days of intense questioning, failed polygraph tests, and mounting evidence, Chris Watts was cornered. His once calm demeanor had crumbled under the relentless pressure from detectives. The facade he had worn for so long was now beginning to show cracks. And finally, after hours in the interrogation room, Chris could no longer keep up the charade. For days, Chris had clung to his story, insisting that he had no idea what had happened to Shannon and their daughters. But as the evidence piled up, surveillance footage, polygraph results, and inconsistencies in his own statements, it became clear that the walls were closing in. At last, the weight of his lies, the pressure from the detectives, and the reality of his situation became too much to bear. Chris finally confessed, but the truth that emerged was far darker than anyone could have imagined. It was not a crime of passion, not a sudden burst of rage. What he revealed was a cold, calculated act that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The details of that night were chilling. After taking Shannon's life, Chris turned his attention to his daughters, Bella and Celeste, two innocent lives that trusted their father completely. He drove them, along with Shannon's body, to an oil field where he worked. It was a remote, desolate place, far from the eyes of curious neighbors and passers-by. In the isolation of the oil field, Chris's final, horrific acts played out. With cold efficiency, he disposed of the bodies, placing Shannon in a shallow grave and forcing his daughters into crude oil tanks. It was a desperate attempt to hide his crimes, to bury the evidence in the most remote place he could think of. The sheer brutality of his actions left investigators reeling. How could a man who once held his children in his arms now treat their bodies with such cold disregard? What darkness had consumed him so completely that he could commit such an unthinkable act? Even after the confession, the questions lingered. What drove Chris Watts to commit such horrific acts? Was it desperation, a desire to start anew with his secret life, or something darker, deeper, an emptiness that had been festering for years? The world watched in horror as the details of the case unfolded. Chris Watts had not only taken the lives of his family, but had tried to bury the truth in the cold, unforgiving earth of an oil field. But no matter how deep he tried to hide his crimes, the truth had finally come to light. What do you think finally broke Chris into confessing? Was it guilt, or did he simply feel cornered with no way out? Did someone capable of such cold, calculated acts ever truly feel remorse? Or was it the pressure of being exposed that drove him to admit the truth? With his confession now public, Chris Watts faced the full weight of the legal system. The nation watched closely as the man who had once portrayed himself as a loving husband and devoted father was brought before a court to answer for his crimes. The case had shocked the world, leaving a trail of heartbreak and unanswered questions. As Chris stood before the judge, the room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sobs of Shannon's family seated in the front row. For them, this was not just a trial, it was a final opportunity to confront the man who had taken everything from them. During the impact statements, the raw pain and heartbreak of those left behind were laid bare. Shannon's parents, her brother, her closest friends, they spoke of a woman who had been full of life, and two little girls who had been taken far too soon. Each word was a testament to the lives that had been brutally cut short, lives that Chris could never. For Chris, there was no defense. He had pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty, leaving the judge with only one decision to make: how long he would spend behind bars. The sentence was handed down swiftly: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the family, it was a moment of relief, yet also a reminder of the finality of their loss. As the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs. Some felt justice had been served. Others believed no punishment could truly account for the horrors Chris had inflicted on his own family. The nation was left grappling with the question: had Chris Watts received the punishment he truly deserved? The case had captivated the public, leaving a lasting impact on all who followed it. A father, a husband, a man who was supposed to protect his family had instead destroyed them. For Shannon's loved ones, there would never truly be closure. But they could at least take solace in knowing that Chris would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, far from the world he had once deceived. Do you think Chris Watts deserved a harsher punishment for his heinous crimes? Or was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole justice enough? Can any sentence ever truly balance the scales for the lives he took so brutally? If this story moved you, share it to spread awareness of the importance of recognizing the hidden signs of domestic abuse. Together, we can prevent such tragedies from happening again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories that uncover the hidden truths behind the headlines.